You're listening to the Small College Movement podcast with Scott Novak. Join me as we learn about the stories, innovations, and successes happening at small colleges around the country. Because remember, great things happen at small colleges.
Since 1772, we've boldly defined the possibilities for women. At Salem College, we're proud to be the only liberal arts college in America with an exclusive focus on making healthier, more equitable communities. Our tradition of excellence is grounded in
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome again to another edition of the Small College Movement podcast. My name is Scott Novak. I am your host. And today's profile, as you heard, is Salem College. So a little bit about Salem College. Salem is a private women's liberal arts college in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Founded in 1772 as a primary school, it later became an academy, high school, and ultimately added the college. It is the oldest female educational establishment that is still a women's college in the United States. Salem is accredited by the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. Salem College offers the Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Science, a Bachelor of Music, Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, a Master of Arts in Teaching, and a Master of Education. On February 24th, 2021, Salem College announced it would focus on preparing students in health leadership. And according to the website, Salem College has transitioned to becoming the nation's only college dedicated to elevating and expanding the role of women in health leadership. Known athletically as the Spirits, it is a member of the Division III and competes in the USA South Athletic Conference. Among its alumni are Sarah Childress Polk, wife of U.S. President James Knox Polk, Emma Augusta Lehman, teacher, poet, naturalist, and botanical collector, graduated in 1864 and taught at Salem for 52 years. Recent Salem alumni include actress Celia Weston and Sarah Covington Fulcher, who currently holds at least 2 world records, the first woman and only one, the third person to complete a 2,700-mile run across Australia, following up the world's longest continuous solo run by any person. And as our guest today on the Small College Movement podcast, I have Gary Daynes, who was the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Enrollment Management at Salem College from 2022 to 24. Gary also has a long history with small colleges, having served roles at Westminster College in Utah, Barton College in North Carolina, and he is also the founder of Porch Consulting and a published author, having recently released the book How to Be a Small College. And there's not a better person to have on the small college movement than someone who wrote a book called How to Be a Small College. So Gary, welcome to the Small College Movement podcast.
Scott, thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation and the introduction. It's great to spend a little bit of time with you.
Yeah, and Gary, as I mentioned in a little bit in the intro there, you have a long storied history and journey through higher education. And tell us a little bit about your journey and your affinity for small colleges and sort of a little backstory for anyone that might be listening.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So unlike a lot of folks who develop their love for small colleges by going to a small college, I developed my love for small colleges by going to a large university and then becoming a faculty member at a large university. So I'm a historian by training. My first faculty appointment was at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, a fabulous school, well-focused, serves its students very well, but it was big. And as a new faculty member, I got the courses that sometimes my colleagues weren't interested in teaching. One of them was called American Heritage, where each semester I taught 3 sections of 900 students at a time. So my enrollment was, in any one semester, was about 2,700 students. So on the one hand, you can do things with a large class and with lots of resources that you can't do in a very small class. But on the other hand, I started to worry that it wasn't really learning that might be taking place, but instead some combination of building social relationships and me being sort of an entertaining person standing on a stage showing video clips and things like that. And that really deepened my interest both in small scale things and in small colleges. So I started first while I was at BYU doing service learning courses, trying to get my students connected with the community. And I just found that I felt called. I felt an obligation and an opportunity to work with smaller groups of students in more intensive and hands-on sorts of ways. So that led me to leave Brigham Young University. I went to Westminster College in Salt Lake City, where I was an associate provost. and then a vice president for enrollment there, because one of the things that you learn at small colleges is you show up at work and there are often different job opportunities
Oh,
presented
yeah.
to you. So I became a vice president for enrollment, thought I wanted to get back in the academic affairs area. So I took a position as a provost at Barton College in Wilson, North Carolina, school with about 1,000 students, spent 8 years as provost there, while also serving as a vice president for enrollment at various times, and started doing more consulting work. Salem College was one of my clients, and during a period of a new president coming on, that President Summer McGee invited me to join. And so I spent just about 2 years there, helping with the transition to the new presidency, continuing to build out this focus on health leadership that you mentioned in the intro. And since that time, I've been working full-time as a consultant with Porch Consulting. So historian, started at a big university, found that large scale didn't work as well for my students and the things that I cared deeply about as smaller scales, and then found that small institutions were the sort of place where student learning, where vocation, where real purpose could be developed. And since then, I've been deeply committed to them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So we had a script, right? We had an agenda we were going to talk about, but I'm going to go off here because I really loved what you said about your experience in teaching. From your perspective, tell me a little bit about the advantages for students in a small college setting as a someone who teaches. Because I have not had someone on the podcast yet that can speak to that. So I'd love to get your perspective on that. What's the real advantage from your vantage point?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And again, some people say that it's just simply the small scale that's really the advantage for student learning. And there are some advantages, but I don't think it's just small scale. It is that if you're teaching at a small scale and you're learning at a small scale, there are both certain things that are available to you in terms of the depth of interactions with questions, with texts, with visual sorts of things, the sorts of experiences that students can have. So teaching a service learning course, for instance, is much more powerful if you have fewer than 20 students than if you have 900 students.
Absolutely.
But the other thing that's so important about small scale is that students simultaneously feel supported, but also know that there's nowhere to hide, right? So when I was teaching 900 students at a time, my job was really to learn the names of my teaching assistants. I never really got to know my students at all, and they could have been paying attention in the auditorium, reading the newspaper, on the internet. I just couldn't know those things. And likewise, a student who was motivated might have really learned a lot, but a student who wasn't motivated didn't have that. But in a smaller classroom, there are both greater opportunities for deep and engaged learning, and also this opportunity to be both more supportive and also to be challenged in ways that you can't get necessarily in a large classroom.
Yeah.
So it's not just having a small class, right? That by itself just doesn't solve everything.
No, it doesn't. And a lot of times when I do work with small colleges, I kind of push them a little bit because the first gut response to is what's unique about your institution is, well, small class sizes. But what does that really mean? Right? That is not as enticing for a prospective student as how you just explained the real true advantages of learning in that setting. So I appreciate that response.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, these days, large universities can say honestly that their students also have small experiences, right? Because they have a gazillion clubs and organizations and every opportunity available. So it's not enough for small colleges anymore to just say like, your faculty members will know your name and you'll have a small class size. That's not a value add. And that doesn't accurately describe the real power of a small college experience. It's the first step towards describing that real power.
Exactly. And because it is such an advantage, obviously large schools spend time telling you that you still have small class sizes. They see it as an advantage, and it's inherent in all small colleges. So I appreciate that response. Question for you as a historian, love to know your perspective on the history of small colleges and why we are where we are today. And we see, let's be honest, there's a lot of college closings and things like that going on. But from where you sit, from your opinion, where have we been and where are we going right now?
Yeah, well, so for most of the history of American higher education, the default type of college was a small college, whether it was a public institution or an independent institution. And that's because such a small proportion of Americans went to college, right? So large scale wasn't really the expectation. It's really in the second half of the 20th century that you started to see really large institutions coming to be of the sort of scale that we think of when we think of a large institution, 20,000 or more students. But for me, the most interesting part of the history of small college is really in the last couple of generations. In the late 20th century and then early in the 21st century, there was a period where there was a lot of growth in both the number of students graduating from high school and the proportion of those students going to college. And in that period of growth, small colleges started to mimic or to follow the practices of larger institutions, adding lots of programs and amenities to students. And there was nothing by definition wrong about that. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's a smart strategic move. If enrollment is growing, right? If the market is getting bigger, add more things so that you can attract more people to your institution. I think there are two challenges that came out of that, though. One, now that both the number of high school graduates is flattening or declining, depending on where you are in the United States, and two, that the proportion of high school graduates who are going to college seems to be shrinking back.
Yeah.
Small institutions that have found themselves to be really complicated, that sort of look like smaller, less well-resourced versions of the big public institution down the road, they're in a difficult position. They're not able to generate as much revenue. They're more difficult to manage because they're smaller, but still very complicated. And therefore, it's harder to say to a student, choose us because you'll get a different experience than if you went to the public institution down the road. Because in some ways, small colleges have tried to look like the bigger institution down the road for a couple of generations. So that's the rub that small schools find themselves at now. It's not just declining enrollments, but that the way that we have behaved over the last couple of generations hasn't necessarily prepared us well for this moment where enrollments are down, where the proportion of college going high school graduates is shrinking, and where there's less trust in higher education than there was even 10 years ago.
Agree. And, again, going off of what you said there, many times in discussions that I've had, more from an enrollment marketing perspective with small colleges, I often say, own who you are, right? There's so many small colleges that say, well, we're 3 hours from Washington, D.C. and 2 hours from Philadelphia. And, we're 2 miles from another college. But that you're trying too hard to be something you're not. Own the advantage of being a rural small college that the educational experience is perfect for the right student. And I think that is something that you sort of touched on, that where colleges make the mistake in some cases of trying to be something they're not. But with that, what do you think the future of small colleges is? I mean, I've started this movement because, as you know, I wanted the negativity of small colleges and the closings and all of that to stop. There needed to be a more positive voice about the advantages of these small colleges. And I know there's a bright future for them. But as a historian, as the work that you've done in your consulting, and we'll get into your book in a little bit, what do you see as the future of small colleges?
Yeah, so I think we will see a range of different futures for small colleges. Some will continue to close. And we shouldn't be surprised by this, right? No. In every industry in America, new organizations start and others stop. And in fact, one of the real challenges for colleges and universities is not colleges closing, but it's so hard to start a new institution that it's hard to take advantage of new opportunities in the market. So some will close, some will grow, others of them will survive but shrink potentially. So that's, we should just expect a whole range of potential outcomes. I think that what we will see, though, is that the institutions that flourish, that do more than just survive, will do it by behaving in a certain sort of way. And it was exactly what you talked about, Scott. They will rediscover and become ever more comfortable with who they are, whether that seems like a super attractive thing or something that to like the broader world might seem as a disadvantage. So they'll rediscover who they are. They will focus around that. That will allow them both to be more authentic. It will allow them to attract students who are really well suited for their institution. It will allow them to offer programs and experiences that really meet those needs. It can only be delivered in the way that they're delivered at that particular institution. And
Yeah.
by doing that, I think those schools will be sort of recreating the market for themselves, right? So, like in the example that you talked about, if you're in a rural setting, the way that you're going to flourish on into the future is making sure that that rural area where you find yourself has a vibrant economy, has a strong population, who has a
Mhm.
high value for education, and who thinks about an independent college or a small college as being a good place for a student to go. You can help create the conditions for your own flourishing, but only if you sort of know who you are and know what those conditions are and are willing to embrace them, even if they seem a little bit countercultural today.
Agreed. And I think there's obviously a lot of public data out there that one could make assumptions about the financial health of an institution based on public data, which I think is a mistake. Because sometimes colleges make very strategic decisions from a financial perspective. Like you said, some will decrease in the amount of students on purpose. Some will cut programs on purpose. Because if you're offering programs that students are not enrolling in, what sense does it make to continue to offer those programs for 5 students that are in it? So I fear that some people will look at that data and people that will talk and say, well, this school must be struggling because they're cutting down this program or they're reducing their number of students. That's not necessarily true. So it's the student and the parent need to be asking those questions of said institution. But also the question I want to ask you is you mentioned schools that are smart about their approach, the ones that spend wisely. What would you say? What's an example of that? And you don't have to mention a specific school, but what are some things that a small college can do or you've seen has done that you feel that they've handled this situation in the right way?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I guess one thing I should say in response is that many small schools have always been on the brink financially,
Correct.
right? That is
Yes.
because their model is about you enroll students, they pay you money, you use the
Hmm.
money they pay you to cover the costs of educating them. You bring students next year. Like the schools
Correct.
I worked at have all these stories like, during the Depression, students were paying their tuition in cotton at Barton College, right? Because they
Yep.
didn't have cash to pay for it. So I think we should acknowledge that probably a healthy financial model for a small institution is not the same as a healthy financial model for Harvard University or the University
Correct.
of Alabama or whatever else. But
Yep.
within that, institutions, I think, are wise when they do the thing that good businesses do: spend their money on the parts of the institution
Hmm.
that generate revenue, that add value. So that means funding your faculty well,
Hmm.
knowing which of the student services are the ones that really matter, and investing in those things. It means being very cautious on administrative expenses. And I think one of the things that's really worrying to me about small colleges is that often at the top tier, they have a senior team that's as large as the senior team at a big public university, and they're paying, they're earning, 10% of all of the
Hmm.
personnel just with that senior team, which is not me saying there shouldn't be a good senior team, just that you have to watch that. So the
Correct.
schools that are doing well, I have seen manage their administrative costs really well. There are lots of really interesting experiences about or experiments going on where 2 or more schools are sharing back office functions,
Hmm.
but keeping individual institutions. So they're no longer collapsing the institutions, but saying like, if you're a school, 2 schools with 1,000 people, you probably don't need 2 provosts. You may not need 2 CFOs, but you certainly need faculty for both of those campuses. So I think back office sharing is something that is really interesting going on. You indicated that some schools are discontinuing academic programs. I think that is a healthy thing,
Hmm.
both because you want to make sure that students have powerful learning experiences and because you want to serve your actual students, not the students that you hope you might have. So if your actual students are interested in, well, when I was at Barton College, it was a liberal arts college, but our students were interested in business, social work, and nursing. We were wise to offer degrees in business, social work, and nursing, which supported the liberal arts parts of the institution. So, um, being wise about administrative costs, having the right academic programs, and I think some of the most interesting changes that are taking place, both with existing schools and new schools, is about being really, really focused on what you say you're going to do. So the example that you brought up of Salem
Hmm.
College, they made a decision to focus on health leadership for women. That's a particular niche, right? They're not
Hmm.
trying to be all things to all people, But with that focus, they have a better opportunity to both operate in an efficient sort of way and give learning experiences that are really powerful for the students that choose that. So that sort of commitment to focus, to being distinctive, has both operational as well as marketing and student learning impacts that are really important.
Yeah, and you mentioned every example that you just gave confirmed the fact that as long as you're not impacting the student experience and taking away from the educational experience that a student has, that's what schools are doing. And that is smart. That's the right way to go about it. And you touched on it at the end, and I would add to this, just from my experience, because I do some consulting work, mostly in enrollment marketing. First thing I would tell a small school that maybe is in a tough financial situation, don't cut marketing. It's not the last thing you want to cut, but it should be one of the last. And I think most organizations, businesses, colleges, they usually think that's the first thing to go, right? Well, we can cut the marketing budget 20%. It's probably not the right thing to do when you're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive from a marketing standpoint. With less students, you have to be smarter about yield and campus events and communicating with them directly one-on-one, which costs more dollars. I think you have to actually ramp up your marketing and enrollment marketing efforts in particular.
Yeah, well said. And I think you have to be wiser about it. Small schools went through this enrollment management period where the philosophy was get a gazillion applications. Certainly some of those students will come to your school.
Yeah.
True,
Mm-hmm.
but probably not as many students as you hope. And talk about losing focus. So that more targeted enrollment marketing, I think, is super important and can be done. But it does take real money to find students who are interested in your particular institution and help support them in making a good decision to come to that institution. And I guess the other thing I would add about students, which I think is a really important point that you're alluding to, is we used to assume that students were attracted by having a million options.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really the case anymore.
It is not.
Both in terms of, if schools would often say, like, we have 75 clubs, like that was an attractive thing to students. Right. That seems overwhelming to many students today. So being clear about who you are, marketing that well, focusing in your operations, both helps the institution operate more effectively, but also aligns with the sorts of things that students today are interested in. They want more guidance. They want clearer choices, especially if you're a first-generation student or from a first-generation family. Things that colleges can do to make the college experience clear, straightforward, purposeful, honest, not confusing. Those are things that attract students to a school. And that's a much more complicated marketing message. And you have to line up your marketing or your behavior with that marketing message in a way that is evidently true to the people who choose your institution.
Definitely. And if you're going to market yourself as an institution that gets to know the student, right, and the small college class environment and all of that, you kind of have to practice what you preach, even in the from a marketing and recruitment perspective, right? It should be a personal marketing and recruitment experience for the prospective student and family to convey sort of the advantages of the institution and get to know them at that kind of level. That requires time. That requires dollars to support an admission staff, obviously an enrollment marketing initiative that is strategic yet aggressive. And I can't stress enough the importance of a very aggressive yield effort to students that are accepted. Because you're right, there's a lot of choices out there. And I think as you mentioned, the old way of casting the net as wide as it possibly can be to get the thousands upon thousands of applications in the door doesn't necessarily lend itself to success for a small college. Tell me, so you talked a little bit about your philosophy and how you have worked with small colleges. Tell me a little bit about Porch Consulting and how you support colleges and what you provide.
Yeah. So I'd be happy to. So I should tell you the story about why my consulting company is called Porch Consulting.
Yes, I do want to know that. Thank you for saying that.
So there are two reasons, right? One is that during the COVID pandemic, a group of friends of ours would gather from time to time on the back porch of our house. And these were folks both in higher education, in independent schools, in public service, in the nonprofit world. And we were living in a rural area in eastern North Carolina. And the question for us was, how do the institutions that we love survive on into the future? And out of that then grew the work that is Back Porch Consulting. So partly it's an homage to those conversations on the back porch. We also work in a way that sort of has a back porch ethos. It's welcoming, it's intimate, but it's also confidential and honest in the way that a back porch conversation can be, but a conversation in your living room maybe isn't. So that's why it's called Back Porch Consulting. So cheers to the best porches in Wilson, North Carolina. That's where that happened. But the work that we do at Back Porch Consulting serves mostly colleges, but I also work with independent schools and nonprofits and churches. And really the work that goes on there is, first of all, to make sure that the institution has a clear sense of who it is, like what's its vision, what's its mission. Is it actually a distinctive mission, or is it a mission that's sort of like, we're a school, we do learning stuff for students, right? That's not a distinctive mission. And then I work with those institutions to help line up their operations and their programs with that mission and with the people that they serve. So sometimes that is about making good decisions about academic programs. Sometimes it's about letting go of the things that used to be attractive 10 or 15 years ago, but no longer serve the populations that you serve in the present. It's often about discovering new things that very much line up with the mission and the vision of the institution and the sort of people that you serve. And then it's organizing to do that. It's the case today that small colleges, small schools, churches are organized in a way that doesn't really help them focus on the things that they do best. Like, most people who work at a small college have 4 or 5 different jobs, and they do bits of those jobs on an ongoing basis. They feel pulled in a million directions and not supported in any of them. That's not healthy for an organization. It's not healthy for a human being. It's not healthy for the students that they serve. So this organizational piece is really important. And sometimes it means saying, we're going to do this thing. We'll be great at internships and undergraduate research, but we're not going to be great at study abroad. We don't have the resources to be good at study abroad. So focus on what you're good on. And you often find that students, customers learn better. And that people who are working there have a better work experience than they did when they felt they were being pulled in a million different directions.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that, and I see this at every school that I work with as well. People just have way too much on their plate with small colleges. They're dabbling in a number of different things, and how that is handled is an important approach, obviously. But at the end of the day, I also find that those that work at a small college that have that type of experience in a day-to-day life, they love the institution. They have a passion for the institution. They'll do whatever it takes to make it successful. But you're right, sometimes that needs to be addressed for sure.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really differentiates folks who work at a small college from folks who work at a large institution, right? People who work at large institutions are often committed to their discipline or to their line of work. And they manifest that at the institution where they're working. People who work at small schools tend to be much more devoted to the institution itself, and they're willing to take on the work that needs to be done. And you just see these remarkable stories of people who have committed, their entire careers, their whole lives to a particular place, who are willing to do whatever, and also have the courage to say, this is the most important thing for us right now.
Yep.
So we're going to go in that direction. And bear the challenges associated with that. So there's nothing more inspiring than sitting in a room of staff members at a small college and hearing the stories, the way that they've come to sort of select that place and the way that they live out its values in their day-to-day lives. If you want to hear stories about what's right with American higher education, talk to people on the front lines at small colleges serving students on a day-to-day basis. Those are heroes.
Absolutely. You really could not have said that any better. That is really at the crux of why I love small colleges so much. Obviously, it's my personal experience having attended one and working with them all for the last 30 years or so. But the way that you express that, sit in a room with a bunch of people that work at a small college and just hear their passion about their institution and their love for what it provides students is you just cannot replicate that. With that, I want to transition a little bit to talk about your book. I'm really excited to have you on here to talk about that, How to Be a Small College. Tell me about the book and what it's about and what people can expect.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Scott. So, How to Be a Small College started as a series of essays that I would write and post on a blog and on LinkedIn, where I was just observing things that were taking place at small colleges and with the communities that they serve that raised really important questions about both how colleges and communities could work together for the flourishing of both of them. So, I've taken those essays and crafted them into a book that really sort of hits on the themes that we have talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
So its first argument is that for a small college to be a small college, it has to stop trying to be big. And
Mm-hmm.
that's both about knowing who they are, it's about simplifying or being less complicated. It's also about being comfortable not chasing the measures of wealth and fame that sort of drive the discussion about higher education. Right? Like if you're a small college and your eyes are on Ivy League schools and big public universities, you maybe have lost track of who you are. So don't try to be big. Focus is the second thing. We've talked a lot about that. The
Yep.
third major theme is about being local. It is
Mm-hmm.
still the case that the vast majority of students go to college within 100 miles of where they live.
Mm-hmm.
So if that is the case, that means that institutions need to be comfortable with where they live.
Mm-hmm.
They need to try to develop the well-being of that community. And they can do that both by educating the people from around there, but also by committing deeply to being part of conversations about economic development, community development, local policy, state policy, just like the down in the weeds things that make a community flourish.
Yeah.
So if you do those things, right, like if you commit to focus, if you commit to being local, it allows you to sort of let your weaknesses be your strengths. And we talked about this at the beginning, like be who you are.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the fanciest residence halls in America, don't lie and say they're fancy.
Yep.
Say this is why they are the way they are, because
Yeah.
we have chosen to invest in these other things that are more important, right? Own that. And I think if you do those things, if you pay attention to the quality of work, both for your students and the staff and faculty and administration, that there's really the possibility of a renaissance for small colleges. And I think you see that with examples we talked about earlier. You see it also with the flowering of a pretty significant number of new, very focused colleges and universities that are springing up in the United States, in spite of how hard it is, because they think they have a distinctive thing that some people want, and they are willing to take the risk to try to deliver it. So it's a hopeful book in the end, right? I do think that there'll be a renaissance of small colleges. Many of them will look very different from the way they look today, but there'll be both a renaissance of existing colleges and new ones that will catch us off guard, and we'll think, dang, that is a good idea. I'm glad somebody thought of that.
Yep, I agree 100%. And you know what? Maybe the small college movement is going to take us all there, Gary, at this point, right? Your book, the movement, podcast, people talking positively about small colleges and the great service they provide for students and their communities. I would challenge anyone, go to a rural small college and just take in the environment and the small town. There is just, in my opinion, nothing better than that. So I totally agree with you.
I totally agree. Like one of the joys of my life is getting a chance to get to know a little bit a community that has wrapped its arms around the small college that is there, and has found ways for both of those institutions to flourish. That's historically been one of the bases of health in American society, and I hope that it will continue to be that in the future. So yeah, How to Be a Small College, it comes out this next summer. So you can learn more about it on my website or on my LinkedIn page. And I'd be happy to have you purchase a copy and continue the conversation.
Great. Yeah, I hope, and anyone that's listening, please do that. Gary, I appreciate you taking some time today to be on the podcast. It was a great discussion. I'd like to have you on again. But again, thank you for taking part.
Yeah, my pleasure, Scott. And thanks very much for this conversation and for leading the small college movement. It's super important. This is the right time to be doing this sort of work.
Well, thank you. I agree. And just a couple of logistics for anyone listening. Officially announced that the National Small College Enrollment Conference is going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2025 from July 28th through the 30th. If anyone's a college administrator, admissions staff, enrollment staff, marketing staff, I encourage you to attend. This conference is built around the idea of sharing stories of success so that small colleges can help one another to grow and strategize. And it is the best conference, in my opinion, for small colleges in the calendar year. So please do attend that. And again, Gary, thank you for taking part today. And I'm going to end this podcast saying what I always do at the end of the Small College Movement podcast. Just remember, great things happen at small colleges, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Since 1772, we've boldly defined the possibilities for women. At Salem College, we're proud to be the only liberal arts college in America with an exclusive focus on making healthier, more equitable communities. Our tradition of excellence is grounded in